In the crowded committee room, the exchange began with the air of routine business. But the undercurrent of tension was noticeable from the start. Ted Cruz leaned forward in his chair, his voice sharp, deliberate, and cutting through the space as Representative Jasmine Crockett began to deliver her remarks. What should have been her uninterrupted moment quickly turned into a series of clashes. Cruz interrupted her once, twice, then a third time, each instance not with the intent of clarification but rather to redirect, to steer the conversation back toward his preferred framing. Persistence became his weapon, a strategy that seemed to work for a time, because each time Crockett paused, the flow of her words was broken, and his presence was reinforced. The interruptions came like a steady rhythm, calculated and constant, yet what he likely thought of as control began to backfire in ways he might not have anticipated. By the fourth and fifth interruptions, it was no longer just about what was being said. The room could sense the pattern. His persistence wasn't about engagement, it was about dominance. Observers began to shift in their seats, some raising eyebrows, others whispering to their neighbors as Cruz's interjections mounted. For Crockett, each break in her speech could have been a chance for frustration to creep in, but she made the choice to stay measured. She sat upright, her gaze steady, occasionally leaning back in her chair, giving the impression that she had more patience than he had persistence. That calmness became part of the story. The sixth interruption made clear what was happening. Cruz wasn't just making points, he was pressing for control of the narrative, inserting himself so often that it seemed less about his arguments and more about keeping Crockett off balance. But in that overuse of persistence, the strategy began to wear thin. Those who had come expecting a typical exchange were instead witnessing a slow unraveling of tactics. Each interjection was supposed to weaken her, but in repetition, it strengthened the contrast between them. His persistence was obvious, but her ability to remain composed became just as obvious. The more he tried to take the floor from her, the more attention fell on how she refused to let it change her posture. This persistence began to work against him because the audience, both in the room and those watching outside, could see it. They saw that she was being interrupted not once or twice, but repeatedly, to the point where it overshadowed the substance of his words. People did not remember each line he cut in with. They remembered the interruptions themselves. Instead of being seen as sharp or commanding, Cruz's actions came across as forceful in a way that lacked balance. Crockett, meanwhile, grew stronger in perception simply by not breaking down under the repeated challenges. It was almost as though Cruz was building the case against himself. Each time he leaned in and spoke over her, each time he cut into her flow, he added to the evidence. Persistence, meant to show his strength and authority, began to highlight something different: the lengths he was willing to go to prevent her from finishing her thoughts. That image stuck, and the more it happened, the more it looked like he was losing control rather than gaining it. For Crockett, every interruption gave her a new chance to show restraint. And restraint, in that room, spoke louder than interruption. When he cut her off, she didn't explode or match his energy. She simply paused, waited, sometimes with a slight look that told the audience she understood exactly what was happening, and then resumed. His persistence forced her into a role she played well, the one who absorbs the blows without letting them break her rhythm. It was a quiet strength that grew more visible with each exchange. By the time his persistence had carried him to the sixth interruption, the scene was set for a turning point. Cruz had invested heavily in the idea that control could be maintained through constant disruption. But the more he tried, the more the perception shifted. Instead of diminishing Crockett, he amplified her. Instead of silencing her, he made her composure the focus. What began as a tactic of dominance became a demonstration of its limits, showing that persistence, when pushed too far, doesn't always strengthen an argument, it can reveal its weakness. Would you like me to now expand Keynote 2 in the same 700-word storytelling style? The moment that shifted, the balance came not in the first or second interruption, but in the seventh. Ted Cruz had already spoken over Jasmine Crockett 6 times, each instance creating an uneven rhythm in the room, with his voice puncturing her sentences and halting her delivery. By then, the interruptions had become predictable, almost routine, as though his persistence would continue indefinitely. But the seventh was different. He leaned forward once again, interjecting with what he believed to be the most decisive line of the day. The words came with force, crafted to corner Crockett into either retreating or stumbling in her response. Cruz's tone carried confidence, as though he had finally found the point that would silence her, or at least shake her composure. Yet it was in that very moment, when he thought the advantage was his, that the turning point emerged. Crockett had been patient through the first 6 interruptions, letting them come and pass without losing control. But this 7th one gave her something unique. It wasn't just an interruption. It was a challenge with an opening she could seize. Instead of looking flustered or caught off guard, she straightened slightly, almost as if she had been waiting for this precise setup. Cruz's words, designed to destabilize, became the very foundation she could build on. She took a measured breath, paused long enough for the silence to draw eyes toward her, and then responded with precision. The room shifted. Her reply wasn't delivered with anger or raised tones. She didn't attempt to outshout him. Instead, She dissected his line piece by piece, exposing its flaws with clarity that was impossible to ignore. The senator, who had spoken with such confidence, suddenly found himself listening rather than speaking. The interruption, which had been meant to derail her, became the platform for her strongest point. The attention that Cruz had tried to pull toward himself now swung in her direction, and for the first time in the exchange, she spoke without a single break. It was the nature of his challenge that made the moment so striking. His words were intended as a weapon, but they contained assumptions that she could easily dismantle. Crockett pointed out the contradictions, highlighted the oversights, and turned his own framing into evidence against him. She was methodical, her tone steady, every phrase deliberate. Observers could see it unfolding in real time. Cruz had overplayed his hand. What had been persistence turned into overreach. His seventh interruption gave Crockett the opening she needed to transform the exchange entirely. Those in the room felt the change immediately. The murmurs that had followed his earlier interruptions grew louder now, but this time they were directed at the senator. People weren't whispering about Crockett being unable to finish. They were reacting to how she had taken control. The seventh interruption, instead of silencing her, amplified her voice. Cruz's confidence, so apparent in his posture and delivery, shifted as Crockett continued. He leaned back slightly, his expression tightening. A small but telling sign that he realized the ground had shifted under him. For Crockett. It was a moment that highlighted not only her resilience, but also her ability to turn pressure into strength. She had endured 6 attempts to throw her off balance, and on the 7th, she pivoted. That single exchange became symbolic of the broader dynamic: how persistence, without precision, can collapse under its own weight. Cruz had relied on disruption as a tool, but disruption loses its power when the person on the receiving end knows how to wait, listen, and then strike back with accuracy. The turning point didn't need dramatics. It was quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. A senator, confident in his ability to control the floor, had handed his opponent the clearest opportunity of the day, and Crockett, prepared and unshaken, didn't waste it. She took his words and reframed them, making them serve her instead of him. The very interruption that was supposed to diminish her became the proof of her strength. Would you like me to move on and expand Keynote 3 in the same style for 700 words? When the room had already grown accustomed to Ted Cruz's rhythm of interruptions, the expectation was that Jasmine Crockett would eventually lose her composure, raise her voice, or snap back in frustration. That is often what such tactics are designed to do: draw someone into a reactive state where their message is overshadowed by emotion. But instead of taking that bait, Crockett chose an entirely different path. She met each of his interruptions not with raised tones, but with quiet steadiness, her restraint serving as its own kind of rebuttal. The effectiveness of her response wasn't found in volume. It was found in precision. After the 7th interruption, when Cruz's words gave her the unexpected opening to take back the floor, Crockett didn't rush into her counterpoint. She let the silence stretch just long enough to recenter the moment. Then she spoke, carefully, deliberately, each word chosen with weight. Where Cruz's delivery had been rapid and insistent, hers was measured and calm. That contrast became the heart of the exchange. She didn't mirror his interruptions, didn't attempt to talk over him. Instead, she used clarity as her strongest weapon. Her composure under pressure drew attention in a way that Cruz's persistence could not. In politics, tone matters as much as substance, and Crockett seemed to understand that instinctively. She didn't need to overpower him with volume. She needed to dismantle him with precision. Each time she responded, she anchored her words in facts, pointed observations, and a clear structure that made his interruptions look less like strategy and more like disruption. People in the room began leaning in, not because she was loud, but because she was exact. Cruz, in contrast, had been betting on the power of constant interjection. His belief seemed to be that dominance of the floor equaled dominance of the narrative. But as Crockett's measured responses accumulated, his method began to look hollow. His voice, which once cut sharply through the room, began to lose its edge against her calmness. Precision has a way of exposing overreach, and that is what unfolded before everyone watching. Every time he tried to wrestle control by speaking over her, she reclaimed it not with force but with focus. The most striking part was that her control didn't appear rehearsed. It looked natural, as though she had decided long before entering the room that she wouldn't be rattled by anyone, not even Ted Cruz. She leaned into her notes, occasionally gestured with small, deliberate movements, and made eye contact with those listening. When Cruz attempted to break in again, the subtle shift in attention was visible. People no longer expected her to crumble under the pressure. They expected her to hold steady, and she did. His interruptions began to lose their weight because she showed that they could not move her off her course. Measured responses often carry more power than emotional ones, and Crockett proved that in real time. By keeping her voice even, she highlighted the imbalance in the exchange. He was interrupting. She was continuing. He was breaking in with force. She was building with precision. That contrast told its own story to anyone watching closely. It wasn't just about the content of their words. It was about who seemed in control of themselves. Crockett never ceded that control, and because of that, Cruz's dominance began to appear less like strength and more like desperation. Asterisk. What Cruz may not have realized in the moment was that each interruption magnified her restraint. With every attempt to silence her, she gained another chance to demonstrate that she could not be provoked. When she finally did respond fully, her precision carried even more impact because it had been withheld until the right moment. Instead of reacting impulsively, she waited for the perfect opportunity and, that patience amplified the weight of her words. Asterisk. Observers often remember not just what was said, but how it was said. In this case, Cruz's aggressive persistence and Crockett's composed rebuttals created a sharp contrast. One sounded hurried, the other deliberate. One sounded insistent, the other exact. That contrast left the impression that while Cruz had been trying to control the exchange, it was Crockett who had truly mastered it. The power didn't come from talking over someone. It came from speaking with precision that couldn't be ignored. Asterisk. Would you like me to also expand Keynote 4 in the same 700-word storytelling style? As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that public perception was no longer following the path Ted Cruz had hoped to set. His series of interruptions had been meant to show dominance, to highlight his control of the room, and to leave Jasmine Crockett looking as though she could not finish a point without him stepping in. Yet, as the minutes passed, the opposite began to happen. The more he tried to assert control through sheer persistence, the more the focus shifted to her ability to absorb the pressure and respond on her own terms. What started as his performance gradually turned into her moment. Asterisk. In the room itself, the shift was almost visible. Early on, when Cruz cut in for the first or second time, heads turned toward him, listening to his challenge. But by the fifth and sixth interruptions, people's eyes began to rest on Crockett instead. They were no longer waiting to hear what Cruz would say. They were watching to see how she would handle it. She became the center of attention not because she forced it, but because she demonstrated something audiences often admire: composure under fire. Cruz's attempts to dominate the conversation had inadvertently made her the main character of the exchange. Asterisk. The seventh interruption sealed that transformation. What he believed to be his strongest line ended up becoming the moment when she delivered her sharpest response. Observers immediately recognized the weight of what had just happened. Cruz had practically written the script for his own undoing, and Crockett had used his words as the material for her rebuttal. The reaction in the room showed it: the murmurs, the slight shifts of posture, the raised eyebrows. By the time she finished speaking, the perception of who held control had completely changed. Asterisk. For Cruz, this was a revealing moment. His strategy had always been clear: dominate the exchange by cutting in, make his presence larger than hers, and ensure that his voice was the one most heard. But in the age of constant recordings and instant public commentary, perception matters as much as content. What people outside the room saw was a senator interrupting a congresswoman 6 times, only to be shut down on the 7th. The framing that reached the public was not that of his persistence, but of her resilience. His interruptions became evidence of her strength rather than proof of his control. Asterisk. On social platforms and in conversations afterward, it wasn't Cruz's lines that circulated most. It was Crockett's response. Clips replayed not his challenges but her calm dismantling of his words. Analysts pointed out the contrast in tone, his interruptions loud and frequent, her rebuttal sharp and steady. The story that emerged was not of his victory in debate, but of how his overuse of interruption created the very stage on which she stood out. The narrative slipped away from him, landing squarely in her favor. Asterisk. This shift in perception was powerful because it went beyond the specifics of the debate. It spoke to broader themes of patience versus force, precision versus persistence, and how control is often judged not by who talks the most but by who communicates most effectively. Cruz, despite being the one who interrupted repeatedly, ended up looking less in command than Crockett, who never raised her voice and never lost her footing. For those watching, it became a lesson in how overplaying a tactic can undo its purpose. Asterisk. Public perception has a way of crystallizing quickly. By the end of the hearing, the takeaway for many wasn't about the subject of their exchange at all. It was about the dynamic between the two of them. The senator who interrupted 6 times was remembered, less for the content of his words, and more for how those interruptions highlighted his opponent's ability to remain composed. Crockett's patience, her choice to stay measured, and her ability to turn the 7th interruption into her strongest moment, all combined to leave her standing taller in the eyes of the audience. Asterisk. For Cruz, it was a rare instance where persistence had not built strength, but eroded it. His interruptions, rather than silencing her, became the background against which she delivered her most effective message. And in politics, where perception often matters more than the moment itself, that shift became the lasting story. Asterisk. Do you want me to now create the 500-word ending statements in the same storytelling tone to complete the piece? The story of that exchange did not end when the gavel tapped, or when the committee moved on to the next witness. Its weight lingered because it was about more than one senator interrupting one representative. It revealed something deeper about the way power can shift in unexpected ways, especially under the scrutiny of an audience that notices not just what is said, but how it is delivered. Ted Cruz believed that his persistence, his decision to cut in 6 different times, would shape the narrative in his favor. He thought that by pressing and pressing, he could keep Jasmine Crockett on the defensive, unable to finish a thought without his shadow looming over it. Yet the strategy that he leaned on so heavily ended up building the very stage on which she would stand tallest. What people remembered was not his interruptions, but her composure. They remembered the calm in her voice when she finally dismantled his seventh attempt to silence her. They remembered that she never lost control, never resorted to shouting, never gave him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Instead, she stayed patient, and when the opportunity opened, she spoke with precision that could not be ignored. That moment reframed the entire exchange, showing that persistence without balance can backfire, and that sometimes the strongest statement is the one delivered without raising a voice. For Crockett. The encounter was a reminder of why restraint is often more powerful than force. She did not win because she spoke more often. She won because she spoke better. Her ability to endure the repeated interruptions without crumbling gave weight to her words when she finally did answer fully. Cruz's seventh line, meant to shut her down, instead became the turning point that gave her the room to command the audience. It was an unintended gift, a miscalculation that flipped the outcome of the confrontation. For Cruz. It was a cautionary tale. His persistence showcased not dominance, but overreach. Each interruption made him appear less in control and more desperate to steer the conversation his way. By the end, it was his tactics, not her responses, that drew scrutiny. The senator who thought he was demonstrating authority instead highlighted the resilience of the person he tried to silence. In politics, perception is everything, and the perception left behind was that Crockett had handled herself with composure while he had overplayed his hand. The broader lesson from the exchange was clear. Strength is not always about who talks the most, who interrupts the loudest, or who dominates the floor. True strength can be found in patience, in measured words, and in the ability to let persistence burn itself out before stepping in with clarity. Crockett showed that sometimes the most powerful way to shut someone down is not to meet them at their level but to rise above it, letting their own strategy collapse under its weight. Would you like me to compile all 4 expanded keynotes, plus these ending statements, into one single flowing